Alright, so we're getting there. Now in our exploration, we can move around the map and pick up sword and shield. We can use the return key to attack, and we've got enemies that chase us, but at the moment, as you'll see, our attack is completely useless. It's time that we gave our enemy some health and made it so that we can actually deal damage to them. So our first step here is going to actually be to give our enemy health. So I'm going to begin by heading into my assets folder, finding my scripts, and creating a brand new one. I'm going to call this one enemy health. So the first thing we're going to do, very similar to what we did with our player's health script when we wanted him to be able to take damage, is to declare our health variables. So the first one is going to be a public integer, which we will call max health. And the second will be another public integer called health. At the very start of the game, we want to make sure that our enemy's health is set to be equal to his max health so that he's at full health. Now at this point, we are going to, again, like with our player, not use our start or update method, but create our own public method. Now it's going to be public because we're going to need our sword or other weapons to be able to talk to it. We'll make this one a public void called take damage. And just like with our player, in brackets here, we're going to make an integer called amount. Now that integer just makes it so that when a weapon deals damage, it can pass in how much damage it wants to deal, and it can vary depending on the weapon or the type of strike, that sort of thing. And all that we want to happen is when this take damage function is called, we want our health to subtract by whatever the amount is passed in by the weapon. The last step here now is just going to be to check to see if the health of our enemy is less than or equal to 0. We want to destroy the game object of the enemy. And because the script will be on our enemy, we don't have to specify which game object because it knows to destroy the object this script is on. Back in Unity now, we can click on our enemy, go to add component, and we can add enemy health. I'm going to give my enemy, let's have him start off with 5 health, and I don't need to set my regular health at this point because it will automatically be set to 5 at the start of the game. All right, so now that we've created a way for our enemy to take damage and to die, we need to set things up so that we can actually deal that damage. So the first thing we're going to do is create a new script. I'm simply going to call this one weapon because we'll be able to use the same script on any weapons that we're having in our game. Now I'm going to click on my sword, head down to add component and add that weapon script onto it. One other little thing that I'm going to do right now is make a short change in our box collider. Previously, I told you to click it as a trigger. However, as I've been planning the long range goals for this game, I realized that we're actually going to want to change that just so we can have slightly more nuanced combat later on. So for now, I'm going to get you to unclick that is trigger button. All right, let's open up our script. So the first thing that we're going to want to do here is declare a public integer called damage. This will allow us to assign different damage levels to different weapons, and later on we can modify that by subtracting the defense of an enemy or its armor or that sort of thing. Now we don't want to be dealing damage all the time or just at the start, so we're going to create a new function. This is going to be an on collision enter function, and this will just fire anytime our sword collides literally with anything. Now obviously that's not what we want. We want it to only fire if the collision is an enemy, but more importantly, because we want to create some room for more complex combat later on, I'm not just going to check to see if it's an enemy. I'm going to check to see if our sword is actually hitting the enemy's weak point. And so if we want later on to have armored enemies or enemies who can only be defeated from behind, we have room to add that sort of combat. So specifically, we're going to check on the specific collider object on our enemy. We're going to check to see if that game object has a tag that is equal to weak point. And at this point, what we're going to do is we're going to call that take damage function that we created on our enemy, and we're going to pass into it our damage. So however much damage our weapon does will be passed in to take damage. All right, so you'll notice that we have some squiggly lines going on here telling us that our script does not like this. That's because it doesn't know which enemy or which script it needs to be talking to here. Now normally we would just declare this up above and we would make a reference to it and then it would be able to work. But the problem is we're going to have hundreds of our enemies in our game and we don't want all of them to take damage every time we hit a weak point. So we can actually fix this fairly easily. What we're going to do down here is when we have found and hit our enemy and we've detected that we've hit a weak point, we now want to talk to the enemy that we've hit. So we're going to type collision, that's the object we just hit. And specifically, we want to look for a component. So I'm going to type in get component. Then in these triangle braces, we're going to type the name of it. So in this case, it's going to be enemy health. Put some brackets. And now within that enemy health script, we'll cause it to take damage, and that damage will be equal to whatever damage we've set to our sword. Back in Unity now, we can decide how much damage we want our sword to be able to deal. Let's go with, let's keep it simple and go with 1. One other important thing we're going to need to do is to actually go to our enemy. Now, as we're just testing here, I'm not going to get too complex, but we do need to make sure that our enemy is actually tagged as a weak point. And so I'm going to click on this. You'll notice weak point does not currently exist, so you're going to need to click add tag. We're going to add one and make sure you spell it exactly like you did in your code. Now we can tag our enemy as a weak point. So at the moment, we're not going to have a specific weak point on the enemy. We're going to make the entire enemy the weak point. And because this is a prefab, I'm just going to override and apply those changes to all of our enemies. So another important change is that because we switched to a collision-centered way of detecting things, I need to switch my item pickup so that it reflects that. So I'm simply going to get rid of my on trigger line. And here we're going to create a private on collision. Just move those extra brackets it put in there. And we should be up and running. I'll take a moment here to click on my shield as well. And in its collider, just make it so it's no longer a trigger. Another important thing is clicking on our player and making sure that we are not rotating when we bump into things. You can do that by clicking freeze Z rotation.
For the most part, things are working really nicely now. When I collect my sword and shield, I can then go into battle, dealing damage to the enemy with each hit. However, as you may notice, there's a problem with his damage coming to me. I am now at -20, which should not be possible, but also single hits are dealing multiple damage, and that's something we're going to need to fix. Now, this is actually a really easy fix that can be done from within our enemy damage script. We simply want to come down into the onCollision enter function here, and you'll notice that at the moment, whenever the enemy collides with something that is tagged player, it will deal damage. The problem is right now, our player has multiple colliders with the sword and the shield and that sort of thing, and so damage is being dealt multiple times. This can be fixed really simply by adding one line here, collision.collider, which will make it so that he's only dealing damage with respect to a single collider, the one that he hit, and in this case, only if it's the player.
So now a couple things have happened. The first one is simply that because our enemy's only dealing the damage if he collides with the actual player, our shield is now capable of actually giving some protection. If he's just hitting the shield, nothing happens, which actually works out quite nicely. However, if I'm playing the game and I don't have the shield, I still have the multiple colliders because of the sword, but now when the enemy hits me, he's just dealing the 20 damage each time and not the additional damage that he was dealing before. Also, when my sword hits the enemy, it's not dealing damage to me like it was before.
We've still got lots of work to do, but that can wait for another tutorial. In the meanwhile, this is the Night Runner. If you found this tutorial helpful, please be sure to click like or subscribe to the channel.